What's up, everybody? From Nautilus, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today, I'm speaking with Dimitris Xygalatas. Dimitris is an anthropologist and cognitive scientist who studies some of the things that make us human. Most of his research has focused on rituals and their ability to soothe, excite, unite, and divide us. To study these effects, he combines ethnographic fieldwork with scientific experiments. He is based at the University of Connecticut, where he directs the Experimental Anthropology Lab. He's written for places like Big Think, Psychology Today, and others, and he's the author of the book Ritual: How Seemingly Senseless Acts Make Life Worth Living. His recent story in Nautilus was an excerpt from that book, which we titled The Real Magic of Rituals. We might call them superstitions or spells, but they genuinely drum anxiety away. Dimitris, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Brian. Good to be with you.
So, to start off, would you mind summarizing your background intellectually for our viewers?
My background is very interdisciplinary. So I was trained in the study of religion and later anthropology as well as cognitive science. And that also shows my approach to studying ritual, which is coming from a variety of perspectives, combining anthropological observation with scientific measurement.
Could you briefly summarize the story we ran in Nautilus, an excerpt from your book for our viewers who may not have read it yet?
Yeah, this story is essentially about what it is that rituals do for us at the individual level. And it makes an argument for why rituals can help people soothe anxiety.
So, what kind of ways um, does ritual do that? How is it able to accomplish those effects? And could you also define ritual for us?
So, okay, to begin with, rituals are those kinds of patterned behaviors that we attribute meaning to, and that we feel that we are compelled to do them, but we either have no particular reason for doing them. People typically just refer to tradition. We just do these rituals because we've always done them this way. Or even when there is an explicit goal for those rituals, there's no causal connection between the actions we undertake and those goals. So if I perform a rain dance, there's no connection causally between my moving about and water falling from the sky. Now, it is precisely because of this disconnect between the goals and the means by which those goals are achieved that it's tempting to see rituals as something useless, as something pointless, as something wasteful. And yet, most of us know that this is not the case. Old anthropological observations that go back over 100 years already point to the fact that people, a lot of the time, perform rituals in order to soothe anxiety. So, famously, Bronislaw Malinowski, an anthropologist who studied fishermen in the Joe Bryant Islands, noticed that these fishermen would perform a lot of rituals before going out in the open ocean to fish in what was very dangerous waters, but they wouldn't perform as many rituals before fishing in the shallow waters of the lagoon. So he first proposed this idea that ritual is this mental technology that people use to soothe their anxieties. But for about 100 years, this had gone untested. It was just in recent decades that a combination of careful anthropological observation and scientific measurement has actually shown this to be true.
So you mentioned that you started your career or your first intellectual interest was in the study of religion. Could you say how that came about and how that eventually led to your interest in ritual?
So my interest in religion was essentially came essentially through my interest in ritual. Growing up in Greece, as I did, um, the kinds of people whose work I admired were people like David Attenborough or Jane Goodall or Jacques Cousteau, who would go out and explore the natural world and explain all these puzzling behaviors. They would explain them in terms of both personal experience, so based on their own exploration and observation, and in scientific terms. And this is something that really captured my imagination. And through those types of documentaries and through types of readings like National Geographic magazine, I often came to see practices that seem really exotic to me, colorful, sometimes very painful rituals practiced in faraway places. So for a long time, in my mind, those were things that other people did, things that were disconnected in space and time. And when I first discovered that people in my home country did the same kinds of things, when they would engage in painful pilgrimages and they would perform fire walking rituals and they would do other kinds of extravagant ceremonies, uh, that was really a revelation to me. So I began to realize what eventually every anthropologist realized, that what at first glance might seem bizarre or exotic uh, very often is something fundamentally human and something that we all, in our different ways, do in our own societies, even if the forms change. At the end of the day, people across space and time behave in similar ways because they're driven by the same desires and the same needs. And that's one of the things that ritual does for us. It addresses some of our primordial needs and desires.
One of the more well-known ancient rituals in Greece, I think, is what's called the Eleusinian Mysteries. Is that right?
Correct.
Is that do you can you describe what that is or what we know about that? I've always found it fascinating.
We don't know an awful lot about it, but the one thing we do know is that it involves some really high intensity rituals. High intensity in the sense that initiates would go through things like sensory deprivation, and then they would use specific techniques to induce a sense of revelation. And this is very similar to what we find in other kinds of initiation ceremonies. And there's, of course, a reason for that. Rituals like initiation ceremonies are typically designed in order to give an experience a sense of tremendous importance. So, in a sense, to our brain, this is a signal that we must pay attention to this experience because it signifies something momentous that is happening. And people across societies engage in ceremonies that follow this same recipe. So those types of ceremonies, for example, rites of passage, that mark some of our most important moments in our lives, whether these might be personal accomplishments like birthdays and graduations, or whether they might signify your membership of a group, like initiation ceremonies. Those ceremonies invariably will be very flamboyant. They will be sometimes they might be even scary and painful. And the reason is that to our brain, they mark that moment as being something momentous, something important, something which will become part of our autobiographical narrative, which means our very sense of who we are as an individual.
Is there any sense in which a human being that is deprived of a significant ritual experience is going to be developmentally dysfunctional or just not optimally set up to realize their self in any way? I mean, how crucial is this need for ritual like built into our developmental psychology?
Mhm. Absolutely. So there are indeed studies that show that families that partake in more holiday traditions and those types of family rituals, that children grow better adjusted and they build better relationships with their parents. But even beyond that, even for adults, I think one of the best demonstrations of that, unfortunately, was the recent COVID pandemic. So what we saw there, this was a massive, unprecedented social experiment, uh, at least unprecedented for our generation, where we saw that at once people were deprived or some of the most meaningful things to them, things like human connection, and things like the ability to soothe our fears and anxieties. And at the same time, they were deprived of some of the most basic social and cultural technologies for addressing both of these problems, both anxiety and social connection. And the response to that was very interesting, it was very spontaneous, and it was global. We saw that people around the world either started adapting age old ceremonies into new types of rituals, for example, by having drive through birthday celebrations, or in many cases, they defied mandates and took great risks to their health or risks of fines and in some countries even imprisonment just to be able to attend something uh, like a funeral ritual because it was very important to them. And in many other cases, they actually created new ceremonies. And an example of that is in many big cities, people would spontaneously come up with this ritual where they every day at the same time they would go out on their balconies and they would bang pots and pans together, which was a first show of solidarity with healthcare workers who are at the front line, but also solidarity towards one another. This was a sign that we're all in this together, and together we shall overcome.
That's right. What was your impetus or the inspiration for writing your book on ritual?
So this book is the outcome of 20 years of research. So throughout my entire academic career, I was interested in the ritual paradox. The paradox is that humans across all cultures perform rituals and they consider them to be deeply meaningful, very important to them. But then when you ask them why, they seem puzzled by the very question. We do rituals just because it's part of who we are. It's part of our human cultures. It's part of human nature. So this paradox fascinated me, and I've spent 20 years studying it. I've lived with local communities, conducting a cumulative 4 years of ethnographic fieldwork, and I've done a lot of lab experiments and field experiments. So all of those pieces of the puzzle, as they were starting to fall together, I wanted to tell this story, and I felt that it was important to me to be able to tell this story not just to my colleagues, not just to a group of academics, but also to a broader audience. And that was the motivation for
Mm.
writing this book.
Did you, in your years studying and living with people performing rituals, did you ever encounter or witness something like truly bizarre that you couldn't explain, like where, maybe a ritual involves what they describe as like a spirit possession? How do you come to understand these phenomena where, radical altered states are generated by some of these intense sort of rituals?
There are many seemingly bizarre phenomena that I've seen in so many years of studying rituals. Uh, Trance is certainly one of the most interesting of those phenomena. The truth is that we do not scientifically understand what it means to be in trance, and people might have different ideas about it or different experiences of falling into trance. But for me, one of the most interesting and intriguing phenomena that I witnessed is that across many different contexts, people have told me that taking part in rituals that at first glance might seem very stressful, very risky, very dangerous, that they in fact take part in those rituals because they make them feel better. They increase their well-being, and in some cases, they're also offered as health rituals, as healing rituals. And that to me was truly remarkable. And in fact, we have
Hmm.
done studies to investigate whether there might be some truth to those claims. For example, we did a study where we followed participants in a very painful ritual over the course of 2 months. This ritual involves piercing the body with dozens or even hundreds of needles and rods and skewers, and embarking in a long pilgrimage under the midsummer tropical sun on a tropical island, and all sorts of other self-imposed forms of torture. And remarkably, we found that people who participate in those rituals, first of all, we see that those who suffer from chronic illness, especially mental issues, things like anxiety and depression, they are more likely to take part in those rituals. And when they do, they reap greater benefits. So, in fact, we saw that those who went through this ritual, they saw increases in their well-being and their quality of life. Those are subjective increases, but they're very important to them. And we also saw that those who suffered the most, those who had more piercings through their body, or those whose stress responses were higher, and we measured those in their bodies, they are the ones who experience the greatest benefits.
That's fascinating. Do you know of anybody in the medical profession that is looking at these findings you're coming up with from your experiments and trying to adapt the power of ritual into a medical setting for people who have chronic pain or are going through cancer treatment or have anxiety and depression, like you mentioned?
This is something that's of interest to me currently, and I've had, in fact, discussions with medical professionals who, for example, told me that they're interested in building better anxiety reducing, better stress management techniques. And one particular example was with cancer patients, people who undergo chemotherapy. It turns out that one of the biggest impediments to the success of the therapy is extreme stress, because of course you can imagine how stressful it is to be going through that. And in many hospitals now, they're offering things like meditation courses or yoga classes in order to help people alleviate their anxiety. So being able to design better kinds of interventions of this sort, I think, could be very important.
Have you incorporated the use of ritual in your own life, or if you have children in your children's lives? I mean,
I have.
for someone, yeah.
So both of them, and that's a very good point actually, because I actually have a toddler in my life, 2.5-year-old, and we are already beginning to think about what kinds of rituals we want to incorporate in our family life to instill in him this sense of a tradition and continuity. For example, we are not particularly religious, and we've never had a Christmas tree around the home, but now we do. Now that we have a toddler, we do, and this is something that we hope that he'll enjoy taking part in those seasonal holiday rituals. And even during the pandemic, where we were not able to see our families who live across the Atlantic, we would have those online meetings where we would go through the preparation of the Christmas tree, all the setting up together at a distance. I also have my own personal rituals, so preparing my morning coffee has developed into this uh, elaborate pattern where I have to make it in a specific way, even if I don't drink it. I have to start my day always in the same way. And beyond that, I also take part in the kinds of collective rituals that are important to me. Things like whenever I go back to my home country, which is Greece, I always visit the stadium of my home team, and I engage in those types of collective chanting and collective dancing and all of those group rituals that are fundamental to one's sense of group membership. And I do see that they have the same effects on me as they always did since I was a kid in Greece.
Would you ever consider, or have you considered implementing a kind of um, like a painful initiation ritual, maybe for like young adulthood for a child? I wonder if you think that's like some ethical quandaries there, even though research shows that these can be really impactful, positive life events.
So this is a really good point that is worth a lot of discussion. One point that I raise in my book is that we have to be very careful. It is desirable to be able to harness the power of ritual in order to build things like social cohesion and a sense of community, and in order to be able to manage stress. But there's a fine line uh, between um, using components that are found in traditional rituals and either making a mockery of those rituals or just uh, completely running wild with those. And what I mean by this is that it's one thing for somebody to become initiated into a community in a painful, perhaps humiliating ceremony, uh, even a dangerous one, but to do this in front of their peers and the elders of their community, and with the knowledge that this is the same tradition that their ancestors have done for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it is a different thing for somebody to be, let's say, publicly humiliated or to undergo a traumatic experience, which is imposed on them by strangers in the context of a corporate team building ceremony, or in the context of some college hazing ritual. Um, my point here is that cultural rituals, they have the effects that they do because they've gone through this process of selection. Every day there are thousands of rituals that will be invented. Only the best of them, the most useful ones, will survive. The vast majority of them will perish. And so when we take them out of context and we try to apply them to different situations, we have to be very careful because they won't necessarily mean what we wish them to mean.
Mm. Can you share any interesting bits from your research or writing that didn't make the final cut of the book? A chapter you were planning on writing but decided to not include, or
So with respect to the chapter you referred to, the one where I'm discussing ritual and anxiety, I could have taken this many different ways. I highlight sports rituals, um, but I could have looked at different contexts, and and I had written about different contexts. For example, uh, the casino would be one place where one could witness the birth of spontaneous rituals. The hospital would be another place. Contexts that involve warfare or natural disasters. Any one of those contexts could have worked just as well. And the reason is that what is particular to those contexts, just like sports, is the high level of uncertainty and the high level of stress. So as the stakes are high in all those contexts, whether we're talking about monetary risks or risks to our careers or opportunities or health risks or natural disasters, those are the same. Those are the contexts where we observe the need for ritual increase. And people have found this in all kinds of different studies. For example, a study done in New Zealand found that after a big earthquake, where a lot of people died and even the local church collapsed, one might have expected people to turn away from God, thinking, where was God when all this happened? In fact, what they found is that church attendance increased dramatically. And the reason this happened is that people felt a lot of uncertainty, and engaging those regular rituals at church was one of the means of coping with that uncertainty.
what do you think is the relationship between ritual behavior and the origins of religion? Uh, what is the connection there, do you think?
So I think that ritual predates religion. It predates religion and extends beyond religion. This is something that might sound surprising to us because we are so used to seeing religious rituals that we think this is the main arena where they're supposed to happen. But in fact, my view is that historically religions simply co-opted ritual and they claimed a monopoly on ritual. But this has not always been the case. There's evidence that our ancestors were performing rituals essentially since the birth of our species. As far as we know, even before we had things like language that would allow us for the creation of religious ideas, and certainly before we had any organized kinds of religion. And also, we see that today, as secularization advances and as many parts of our life are becoming less and less religious, people are turning towards other types of rituals. So those rituals might happen in the context of uh, public institutions like the courtroom. They might happen in university graduations, in presidential inaugurations. They might happen in the context of concerts or events like Burning Man. They might happen in all kinds of contexts. And that really shows that the need for ritual is so deeply ingrained in us that it remains even in the absence of religion.
Right. It's like a psychological constant that it like the need or the tendency to generate rituals is like ineradicable. Like you can people might forget a ritual or culturally like might become lost, but then new ones will always come about.
Absolutely. And this is precisely,
Yeah.
so it's the other way around. It's precisely why religious organizations, just like political organizations, states and governments, or military units, or all kinds of groups, uh, they use ritual, they co-opt it, and they incorporate it into their doctrines as a way to boost whatever ideology they're supporting.
Mm. Was there anything particularly hard or challenging about writing the book? Any sections that gave you more difficulty?
Overall, it was pretty hard to write a popular book. I've written academic books before. This was a different style, a different genre. I was um, I was very interested. I wanted to write this book for a broader audience because ritual is something that everyone can relate to. And I found the whole process being both more difficult than writing an academic book, but also much more fulfilling.
Mm.
There are certainly some parts of the book that might have taken me longer to write. I guess the ones that describe my own work were easier to write. I was more familiar with them. And in other chapters, I just had to do an awful lot of reading to write them. But I think the hardest part was already done. And that hard part was the 20 years of research that went into what's in the book.
Mm. Can you say anything about the impact your excerpt has had? What sort of response have you seen? Have you heard anybody mention the piece to you? Or
I did. I certainly noticed a lot of mentions on Twitter and other social media. Uh, I have received emails from people who can relate to this. I received one very funny email from one particular individual who um, told me that they agree with me, but they really do not like Nadal because in that piece I describe the kinds of rituals that Nadal performs before games, and they said they wish that he wouldn't have this ritual advantage, so he would lose more often.
like rituals should not be allowed. It's like a performance enhancing practice.
Yes, like a doping practice.
That's funny. What are you working on at the moment? Any papers or popular articles?
Right now, I'm working. Most of my research looks into the implications of these ritualized behaviors. So more broadly, starting from ritual and moving into other areas of life, including music and dancing and sports fanship, I'm asking questions that are of a similar kind. And those questions are more broadly: what is it that makes us human? What are the things that make us human? But not the obvious things, not our need for shelter and food and sex, not those kinds of things. The things that we consider fundamental for not just to live, but to live well, to live a good life. And those things are uh, things like ritual, things like art and music and dancing, all of those things that, much like what's in this book, at first glance might seem like a waste of time, but at the end of the day, they're a fundamental part of who we are as a species. and they play fundamental roles in allowing us to live a fuller life.
How would you describe the way that the United States now, as a national community, engages in ritual? Do we need more ritual, or I mean, how do you feel about the current state of ritualized behavior on a kind of national communal level? Is it Do we need more, or how do you see that as an anthropologist studying this?
So I tend to think that the amount of ritual that goes into any kind of society is roughly stable. The one thing I notice is that the domains in which it happens may shift. And the United States is one of the prime examples of this happening. What I mean by this is that up until the recent past, uh, almost all of the rituals you would see out there were religious rituals or state rituals. As human societies are becoming more and more democratic, so we have less royal families and fewer dictatorships, and hopefully we do. Those types of rituals that are very important for allowing them to stay in power, we see fewer of those rituals. At the same time, as religiosity declines, we see fewer religious rituals. And wherever this happens, we see an increase in all kinds of other rituals. So one of the things I've written about in the United States is the rituals that happen at Burning Man or other similar events. Another example might be workplace rituals. We see that a lot of companies are now incorporating rituals by design in order to give their members a particular type of experience that allows them to have more to find more meaning in their job or to build better teams and to cooperate more.
Do you have anything normative or prescriptive to say about this shift in ritualized behavior? So you say that ritual behavior always attains a kind of equilibrium, where if it decreases in one domain, it'll increase in others. Is that a good thing, or is it kind of a neutral thing? Or I mean, are we going
I,
to what sort of effects do you think we'll see as a result of this?
I think it's a neutral thing because at the end of the day, uh, ritual, at least at the collective level, allows us to find more meaningful, to create more meaningful social identities. And I think what is shifting is not ritual; it's these different social identities themselves. So perhaps people now find more connection with different kinds of groups as we have more mobility, as we have more multicultural societies, as we have more secular societies. The types of communities that we find ourselves identifying with and relating to are just different. And our need for ritual in order to make those experiences more meaningful are stable. And their forms change, but their essence remains the same.
Right on. To close out, do you want to tell our viewers how they can find you online, whether you have a Twitter or a website where they can see your work and look forward to more of your stuff coming out?
So one of the benefits of having such a rare last name is that you can just type my last name and you will find me. So xygalatas.com, or my Twitter handle is also Xygalatas. So it's very easy to find me.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Dimitris. It was great talking to you.
Thank you. A pleasure.